we think that pharma, as an industry, is fundamentally broken. And it's broken because it fails to serve its primary user, which are patients. It's never been more expensive, time-consuming, or risky to bring new drugs to market. And the reason for that is because pharma at its core is a very monopolistic and closed system. It lacks fundamental transparency. And the reason behind that is that IP ownership, which is the primary value driver in pharmaceutical drug development, is a monopolistic asset class. This means that IP today is encapsulated within single companies or organizations that ideally only have an incentive to share positive data about the research that they're doing. And if you think fundamentally how science should work, science should be open and collaborative. But companies are only kind of collaborating within their organizations around how their IP is developed. What we're fundamentally trying to change at Molecule is the way that intellectual property works today. So if we think what really comprises pharmaceutical development or biotech development, it's two core value drivers, namely IP and data. And if we think about what IP is, intellectual property, it's intellectual. It's a virtual asset by design. But IP as an innovation driver for companies and for society as a whole has been stuck in the 20th century. It's really tied to these extensive 20, 30 page long legal contracts where lawyers need to negotiate over months. And essentially what that does is it creates a very high barrier to entry for developers, for researchers wanting to openly participate in this market. And what it also means that IP ownership in the way that IP works today is fundamentally monopolistic. IP by design is a monopoly by a specific company or a group of people to govern an asset for a specific amount of time. Specifically, for example, if it's the case of a patent. And so at Molecule, we began asking ourselves, what if we moved IP ownership into the public domain? So for IP to be publicly owned and governed by their primary stakeholders. We feel this could fundamentally change the way that biotech research works today, and that patients and funders can come together to bring new research to market. So at Molecule, what we're really building is an open market for decentralized drug development. We're building this because so far the current biopharma ecosystem has been quite intransparent. It's hard for people to transact in IP, and it's especially hard for researchers to obtain funding, be it to finance an early stage startup, or be it to simply get financing in an academic lab. The fundamental thing that we're doing is we're helping researchers virtualize their research and help them collaborate and get funding from people across the world, organizations, investors that want to fund their research. So what we're doing at a technological layer, we're fundamentally tokenizing and through that democratizing ownership of the underlying intellectual property of research projects and of the research data itself. And we make that research data secure and accessible to potential interested parties. So this means now that multiple parties could begin collaborating on an asset. They could jointly fund it, or they could much more easily make a decision to acquire the research and then through that accelerate it. So over the past couple of years at Molecule, we've built a very strong network of industry advisors, industry experts, many academic institutions, and researchers, as well as funders. So our core goal there really is to build a community that wants to gather and that wants to build a decentralized biotech future together with us. And for us, this is really a pivotal moment in development around biotech. In biotech, we see so many different trends that are converging. And we hope that through enabling a new decentralized biotech system that can provide access to medicine, potentially at a speed that we've never seen before, that this can have a similar impact, let's say, as a fintech or decentralized finance has had in terms of access to financial services. And for us, those developments are really fundamentally community-driven. So one of our, I think, biggest achievements in that sense as well is having had the opportunity to really form an early and strong community around this. So where our approach is fundamentally different, for example, than crowdfunding approaches that we've seen in the past, is that Here, the primary stakeholders of a new therapeutic, patients and the researchers bringing it to patients, now become co-owners and they can govern the underlying research and the underlying IP. That means the patients could now decide what access or pricing of that new drug looks like. The researchers could quickly kill off the drug when they realize that it's not working. So in this model, it's really you're bringing in elements of crowd intelligence, where now in a public market, the crowd is curating the best assets as they progress. And we could also much more likely prevent bad drugs from kind of coming into the pipeline or simply like therapeutics that don't work, which cause massive costs for the industry and patients down the line. We also think this could be highly useful for pharmaceutical companies that today are often struggling to find innovation and to due diligence the assets that they're looking at. And in biotech and pharma, there's typically something known as the reproducibility crisis. So it's often hard in a due diligence process for one entity to reproduce the data that another entity is showing it. And that comes back to IP ownership being fundamentally monopolistic. So if I own a piece of IP, my primary incentive is to share positive data about it. I'm not going to tell you that the drug that I'm developing probably doesn't work. So out of the 100, let's say 100 research, out of 100 research studies that are being done, if 1 or 2 are positive, you're going to see the positive ones. You're not going to see the 98 ones that failed. And where a public market here would change is that people would become data-driven. They would see data, they could potentially see data emerging about some of these projects, and they could make financial decisions based on that. They could decide to withdraw funding from a specific project or allocate more funding to another project. And we feel that type of public collaborative curation market for therapeutics could be enormously beneficial to society. So with our infrastructure, we're primarily trying to serve very early stage researchers, researchers that work at biotech companies or that are in academia. These could be individuals or companies that are looking for novel ways to attract funding and build communities around their research. And so there's a typical stage in biotech development termed the Valley of Death. And it essentially means that lots of innovation that is developed that comes out of basic research into the early stages of drug development never even makes it into the clinic. So the primary reasons for that are a lack of access to funding, even being discovered as a researcher. So research is typically spun out via tech transfer offices or then it sits in individual biotech companies. And so we try to imagine what would happen if other researchers could discover your research. If the research was easily discoverable and then it was easily fundable and could quickly move from one entity to another. Or what we would also do is we would modularize the research or a specific research project, meaning that multiple entities can now collaborate to bring an asset to market together. So the primary user base that we're seeing early on in Molecule are really researchers that are in academia and in smaller biotech companies that are looking for new innovative ways to raise financing. So something that we often hear from the researchers that we work with is that they spend 80% of their time applying for grants and looking for funding and only 20% of the time doing research. What we want to do at Molecule is we want to flip that and essentially allow researchers to spend much more time doing their research and spend less time looking for financing. So at Molecule, we've tried to be quite agnostic in terms of what research areas we want to enable, but we're also quite practical in terms of what research areas in which areas researchers are quite open to trying new solutions. So historically, our team has been very active in the longevity and aging research space. It's an interesting community because it's a little bit similar to the Web3 and crypto community. It tends to be fundamentally open. There's lots of great conferences, people share, people collaborate, and we found that was a really good early product market fit for us. But now already we're at a stage where we're actively being engaged by other teams, people that are coming in with ideas, funders that want to fund a specific research area through our platform. And as a company itself, we want to remain relatively agnostic in terms of what comes through our system. Be it helping fund malaria research, be it helping fund rare diseases, or be it develop a new anti-aging drug. We leave that actually up to the market to really decide and to market participants to govern. So you could have a scenario where a research project is highly profit motivated and really, like, let's say, follows the traditional biotech playbook, where even those stakeholders in that asset are really just clearly looking to make a return. And that's okay, because we're not trying to control the market. But you could have other scenarios where you could have a patient advocacy group that in the early stages acquires one of these assets and makes it very clear that it never wants that, that drug to go over a certain price. It could really just try to bring the asset to market at cost, because their fundamental goal is to make that therapeutic as widely accessible to as many people as they can. And so we try to be quite neutral in that sense, because I fundamentally believe that technology should be neutral. And that's how we're building our system. Our software is an open source software stack that we're trying to enable other people to openly build on. And fundamentally, Molecule should be protocol and community owned. What that means is also that in the future, the community itself could be able to decide what research projects should come via Molecule, and maybe also what research shouldn't be on the platform. So if you imagine the development of a toxin or let's say a new type of nerve gas, in later stages of the system, the community itself and the system itself could decide to not allow certain IP to come onto the protocol. We see that as a very long-term development, essentially truly decentralizing the full ownership of the platform. But we, let's say as a team and as a community, are relatively agnostic. Our team operates at a very unique intersection, which is the intersection of Web3 technologies and biotech. And so we've assembled a team and a set of advisors over the past 2 years that are really experts in both industries. So myself, for example, I come with a background in economics, but have been interested and deeply engaged in the biohacking community for many years. My co-founder comes with a background in biomedical research, having worked on cancer research, in aging research, HIV vaccine development. And over the years, we've really built a team of experts at the legal intersection of how do we transact an IP, how do we develop new scalable IP frameworks, a tech team that spans both data analysis in biotech as well as deep Web3 smart contract development. And then I'd say our team is really increasingly a community. We want to build Molecule as a really open community and system that people can come in and build on. And really, we want to enable the emergence of other teams to come in and build in the therapeutic areas that they want to build it. One thing that we're actively trying to promote at Molecule is really pursuing open science principles. If we look at how software development has changed over the past 20 to 30 years, the industry was completely revolutionized by the Linux Foundation early on, and then through open source software frameworks. Just ask yourself, why can you download all these apps today for free, when about 20-25 years ago you used to buy a CD that had a very specific access key on it that you used to enter on your computer? And pharmaceutical development today is still really at the point where we're entering CD keys, when the entire space could be so much more open and collaborative. So our hope at Molecule is to really enable open source drug development and open source driven drug development. The emergence of Web3 technologies have really ushered in, I think, a new age of how we can collaborate and build together and transact in value through the internet. So what blockchain in this case enables us to do, it enables us to virtualize IP ownership and make that IP ownership openly shareable and transactable. And that's something that was never previously possible. So one of the most important things that we've been developing in Molecule is a new framework called the IP-NFT framework. So this stands for intellectual property, non-fungible tokens. And non-fungible tokens have really ushered in a new way of digital ownership on the internet. And for us, what we've developed is a perfect vehicle to encapsulate IP and make it transactable. And what we're now doing with this is we're building a public marketplace. So imagine hundreds, thousands of research projects that are essentially showcasing their innovation through this mechanism, but they're also protecting their innovation. So the IP-NFT is based on two components. One is a legal component, so actual intellectual property licenses around a specific research project, around a patent, for example. And the other component is really a federated data storage that allows the IP holder, the NFT holder, to engage with that data at any point, to share access to it, and enable other participants to work on the data or to due diligence the data. So what we're also helping create is the emergence of new types of decentralized biotech organizations that can actually now actively operate on these marketplaces and help advance these assets into the clinic. And there, I think one of the most interesting design parameters that we're helping to build are DAOs, which is short for decentralized autonomous organizations. So these are organizations that live on the blockchain. They're non-incorporated entities, and they're comprised of thousands of individuals that want to help in a specific area. So you could think this, for example, happen in specific disease areas, rare disease and patient advocacy groups that come together to form these new types of decentralized organizations, collaborate across the world to help them bring new therapeutics that affect them to market, and then to own them together as a collective and as a community. And I think it's really interesting there to think about what would that do to access of new medication, what would it do to pricing. So what we're seeing already is the emergence of DAOs around rare diseases, DAOs around diabetes, for example. We recently helped launch a DAO focused on longevity research that is now comprised of hundreds of researchers that have joined this organization from across the world. And we believe the speed at which those new organizations can move, and also the culture and ethos at which they move, could fundamentally change how the industry operates today, for the benefit of patients and researchers. In 10 years, I imagine a world where I could open my phone and let's say I'm affected by a specific disease, and I can Google, like just simply on our app, look up what type of innovation is currently being worked on there. I could potentially even get in touch with the research team working on this if it's, for example, a rare disease. I could actively begin funding the research that affects me, and potentially even really benefit from it financially. And so what we're also trying to enable with this is financial freedom for researchers, and a new way for them to actually benefit from the innovation that they're creating, and also more financial freedom for patients who I think have really been neglected in the current drug development system. Because as a patient today, I simply have no choice. And so fundamentally for us, Molecule is about freedom and access. It's about giving people a choice.